We'll give it a few minutes for some more folks to join, and then we can get started.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
How's it going? This is my first meeting I'm joining, so I'll wait for your cue here on how this typically works.
Sure. Yeah. We'll wait a few more minutes for some folks to join. But then once they do, we usually start off with new folks introducing themselves, followed by some agenda items. The person who normally runs this meeting is out of office for today, so I'll be running the meeting, at least part of it. Might need to hop off at the bottom of the hour, but yeah, we're right now just trying to go through and quickly see what agenda items should be on here.
Cool.
All right, so as we're getting started, just gonna post stuff in here to feel free to add your attendance to the meeting notes, as well as anything you want to add to the agenda. I know we don't have a very packed agenda today. Mark is out of office, and so I'm not sure if there was anything specific outside of normal 1.0 updates that we're going to be focused on. But I'll give it another minute now that a whole bunch more folks are joining. Whoops. All right, so we can get started. Just as a reminder to folks, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after, and your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. All right, so before starting off with any agenda items, is there anybody new who wants to introduce themselves?
Technically, I'm new, Nicole Schwartz. I've been creeping on the notes in the Slack channel for the past year, and somebody finally got me on the meeting invite. So, hi. I'm with Active State, and not sure what else we generally put in with the intros, but feel free to ask.
Yeah, I think, well, so I know that a few folks from Active State over some time, and I know some folks have left Active State, but so if there's anything you wanted to sort of talk about with your work with SLSA, or you're interested in the SLSA specification group, feel free to talk about that.
Well, I guess so far we have a version 0.1, because 1's not out yet, available for any of our customers in our open source builds. So for anybody who doesn't know what we do, we basically build forked copies of, well, they're not forked, mirrored copies of open source projects so that they're built hermetically and you can get attestation software with them. We do keep running into issues, which is why we're trying to keep involved, because a lot of the specs seem to kind of miss out on the middleman situation. Like they clearly cover if you're the originator or the software developer, but us in the weird middle seem to get missed. So that's why we're keeping involved, and hopefully we're making it super easy for everybody to get attestations for their open source.
Cool. And you might be interested in one of the agenda items that's maybe at the end there regarding trying to clarify some of that. All right. I know that Claudia, you began to introduce yourself, but would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. I'm Claudia. I work at Active State with Nikki, actually. So we both jumped on today after finding the OpenSSF calendar, which is great. And so same deal, +1 to everything Nikki said related to SLSA specs and our involvement in attestation and SBOM generation.
Cool. All right. So, yeah, so next up, I guess is, so we have 1.0 open for review. And I believe that there's some issues that are related. And let me go and actually go through. Let me go through the issues here. Where is this? So here is the, there's a couple of different issues regarding this. So some are more practical, and actually let me just do. And so I'm just gonna, there's a couple of what I'm gonna call meta issues, which are like, hey, should we be versioning? So if there's one issue, issue 680, and let me see if I can share my screen here. So one of the issues that was opened up by Mark was, should we be versioning specification and the provenance spec itself and the requirements around the build similarly? With the idea here being that, like, we don't want to, you know, do we want to have something where you have V5 of the spec, but you're on V2 of the requirements, and it could cause some confusion about, well, if I'm following the V5 of the spec, does that mean I need to be on V5 of the requirements, or well, what does that really mean? And I think that there's some stuff here around figuring that out. There's some suggestions from these folks, I think largely saying we should be have some semantic versioning, more or less stay in lockstep with allowing for some minor revisions to something like the spec, not requiring a whole bump to the version of the requirements, but as long as it's like a minor revision. Folks have thoughts around this?
I mean, this is already a complicated process, so reducing mental load for people, I think by keeping them in step is fair.
Next,
Yeah,
Eric?
I agree. Just to clarify though, so like, are you guys thinking like we would have version 1 and version 1, but then when we update the provenance spec, it'd be like 1.1, kind of within that kind of idea?
Yeah, I think the I don't think there's any details yet, but I think the general, like, I think first is what approach should be taken. And then followed by like what that might look like.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense for sure.
Arnaud?
So, I'm all for simplicity, but in this case, I'm a bit concerned that we would be tying provenance to the rest, because I think provenance in particular is an area where we can easily imagine doing newer versions without changing anything else to the SLSA spec. Like, we have had discussions about possibly tying provenance to an SBOM, and that would change nothing to SLSA. And I think versioning SLSA because we're changing provenance is maybe not the best. I don't know. I'm a bit hesitant.
Yeah, I think the idea of, so I have the same sort of concerns. I think there might be some way we can sort of work around it by sort of still tying the requirements somehow into the version of the provenance spec. Right, like where something like, you might imagine, hey, if there's version 2 of the requirements, maybe regardless of whatever you do with the spec, it becomes sort of like a point on that thing of like, version 2 of the requirement. So anything after the point is going to be what version of the provenance spec is tied into that. So you could have like version 2.10 of the provenance spec, and it refers to version 2 of the requirements, something like that. I think I think we're also still, once again, this issue was just opened a few days ago, so I don't think there's any decisions being made. But I think we would want to, because I think you bring up a good point. It's also something that I think a lot of us are worried about, is you don't want to end up preventing like the spec from being updated just because you haven't updated the requirements. I didn't see if somebody else added their hand there. Sorry. Now that I'm sharing my screen, it's hard to tell. Whoever's up next. Chris.
So I'm in favor of versioning the spec and the provenance together. Should we also put the VSA format, or should we group the VSA format into two, or leave that separate?
So I personally don't have much of an opinion one way or the other, outside of, I think, generally, the more we can, I think from the end user perspective, the thing that folks want is they want to have it packaged up as much as is possible. So they know like, oh, I need to hit like SLSA 3 or SLSA version 3. And okay, these are all the things that are required for SLSA version 3. I need to be this provenance spec. I need to be this, and the other thing. This is the VSA or whatever. Like, I think that's sort of where folks want, but then that has the trade-off of, from a maintainer point of view, of when we try to create new requirements or try to create new things in any of the specs, or if we come up with something like the SLSA source spec, right? Would something like the SLSA source spec require change it? I think that sort of stuff is yeah.
So I read the issue 680 as, being inclusive to all the different pieces we have, which is indeed, which it would include the essay. I don't know, I mean, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what Mark exactly had in mind, but that's the way I read it, the issue he raised. It was like, okay, let's get rid of all the different specs, put them all in one bundle, and only have one versioning for everything. Which I think makes sense. If you really want to go that way, then you have to do it all the way. Otherwise, we're not really eliminating the issues it's talking about, which is, managing all these different pieces with different versioning.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Yeah, for a half second, I was thinking of in a way where it'd be 3 different versions, right? For the requirements, for the provenance, and then for the VSA. But yeah, Arnaud, I think you're onto something, right? Like bundle it all together into one, because for another half second, Chris, when you asked, do we version the VSA different? Well, yeah, if we bump it up to, version 2, but we haven't changed anything in the VSA, then that'll be very confusing. So bundling them all together into one thing maybe makes more sense.
So one idea I just had, and this is just, I think, something from that maybe we can take just generally from software, is I do wonder if we can say that some element of SLSA, let's just say the complete package of SLSA is versioned, and when we do even minor releases, right, like these things are, I think we just need to be clear about these things are what has changed in those things. So like, for example, I would almost imagine that the VSA spec, the requirements, and some of these other things are all almost dependencies of SLSA itself, like the full package of SLSA. And so we might be able to still do something on that end, where we might be able to say, hey, this is, we made an update to the such and such, to the SLSA provenance spec. And so now we're updating SLSA to this sort of stage. I think the problem that we still run into, right, is with a lot of this stuff is, given that it is a specification that folks are intended to consume along with requirements that or indicate what's in that specification, it becomes harder for the end user to then consume and say, well, what happens if this person's on SLSA version 3.2 and this other person's on SLSA version 3.3? Is there general compatibility between them? What are the real differences? What are the real like semantic differences that they should be considering when consuming that? Like, does SLSA 3.3 add something that comes in that makes them think this is now, like, I need to think about my security completely differently.
So just to be clear, I mean, you guys have been talking about requirements as if it's separate, but requirements are part of SLSA spec, right? So right now, this is completely tied to the SLSA spec version. Well, we have, as far as I can tell, we have 3 pieces. We have SLSA, including requirements. We have provenance and VSA. Those 3 are 3 independent pieces. I don't think I'm missing any.
Yeah, I think that's right. By that I mean, and once again, I think there's still confusion tied to, so by the spec, I mean the provenance format. That's really what I mean, and I need to, maybe we should call it the provenance format as opposed to the provenance spec or provenance format. Yeah, anyway, I do think, the provenance, so I agree. And I think the provenance format also, there are certain elements that are inevitably tied directly into the requirements and that element of it. And then there are certain things that necessarily aren't. And I think if we were to version them separately, we would also need to make sure that the format indicates what version specifically, like even what version of the requirements you're associated with as well. And definitely complicates it.
It does.
I mean, I guess I was thinking in my head that when a major version bump happens, there's some kind of major breaking change. And so like everything, the VSA, the provenance, and the spec got bumped to say version 2 or version 3. And then independently, as long as it was an addition or a optional and not anything breaking, that the individual items could all iterate on, minor releases within that as much as they wanted. But if something like, I don't know, VSA for some reason was going to make a breaking change, it would have to wait for the next major version or force a major version. I guess how I was seeing it in my head. And somebody had mentioned like having good release notes of saying like, this, we bumped SLSA VSA to version 3.4, and it's compatible with all of the other 3 that just has this new optional field or this new additional variable. Or there's this new optional attestation type that's, not required yet.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think that's some of the stuff that, if you look at the issue, some folks, what happened to my sharing? Some stuff with that folks have been bringing up with, like doing something like semantic versioning, and also like I do think, yeah, like if we, as much as we can, take elements from sort of like the general software space of saying, hey, these are backwards compatible changes, these are backwards incompatible changes, and these are the sorts of things you can expect between minor revisions, and making sure that that's clear, and also I think relatively consistent with how the rest of the world tends to handle these things, which I think would be important, because I think there are going to be also things that when we release this version of SLSA, this version of the SLSA provenance spec, I think we also need to, the SLSA provenance format. There's going to be there might be, for example, when we release SLSA version 2, nothing might change with the SLSA provenance spec. I doubt it, but there might be literally no changes to the provenance spec. It's just hey, here are some different requirements, and you still use the provenance spec generally the same way. You just, and I think that sort of thing is, we might just still do something where we bump the provenance format anyway and say, hey, but yeah, Chris?
I think bumping the provenance format anytime we bump the spec is fine. I would also be very surprised if we hit SLSA 2.0, and even if we left the provenance format the same, if its meaning stayed the same. I'm not sure that that's a realistic scenario to design around.
Oh, yeah. So I think it's less about necessarily that and more just, because at the same time, I could also imagine a scenario, right, where we've been updating the provenance stuff to meet certain things, and then when we change the requirements, so actually, let me ask you this. So do you think the idea here is that the way that the provenance spec is even used is the provenance format is even used is also part of that? It's part, so even if, actually, let me take a step back. If I were to just provide an example, are you saying that you sort of view it differently, where if you have elements that are required, if you have these set of requirements, you fill out the SLSA provenance format, let's say version 2. And then when you have different requirements, even though the provenance format hasn't materially changed, the meaning behind how it's filled in might change. So you actually still want to say, this is now technically a new version of the format because the way it's intended to be used is different?
Yes, I see the provenance as a representation of meeting SLSA's requirements. And if the requirements have changed, the provenance's meaning has changed. So yeah, it's a new sort of provenance, or a new version of the provenance.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that there's obviously going to be some things we'll have to sort out on that front with regards to, because I think the other thing that's been brought up as well is, never mind. I forgot what I was gonna say.
I think that makes sense, but I mean, I also think the cost of that, right, is that we are putting the burden on the consumer to figure out whether there's actually some meaningful change or not in how they should interpret the provenance they are getting. And we may create more churn than it's worth in a way, but because you were talking about like, release notes or your main, but this becomes really critical. It's like every time we bump the version number, people started, implement it, they produce a new provenance with a new version, and people say, oh, shoot, it's not, that's changed. What does it mean for me? In some way you can say, well, it's a good exercise. They go through to, do the analysis. At the same time, you're definitely increasing the burden on everybody every time you bump the version number.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of it is it's a little bit complicated generally because some of it could be solved if, let's say, there was an official set of SLSA libraries for the different things, and just sort of say, hey, if you use Go, this is, and so then when we versioned to 3.0 of the spec from 2.0 of the spec, you'd still be able to like, oh, okay, now I just need to import version 3, but it's still, at the end of the day, somebody has to go in and say, well, when I fill in the blanks of the provenance format, some of those things might have different semantic meaning of, what used to, mean this now means this slightly more, different thing. Like when I look at stuff like isolated and ephemeral, one of the other tickets on from 1.0 is there's still a lot of confusion as to what does isolated and ephemeral mean? What does remote execution mean? What do some of these other things mean? And as we clarify those things, they fundamentally have a different meaning inside of the documents, and we need to have a way to specify that, and some of that could be specified via the URI element of what version of SLSA provenance format that folks are using. You could say, hey, this is the, we're using version 3 or whatever, and version 3 now means that this field means something different, but it's still a much fuzzier thing than normal like software where you can say, hey, this thing used to take a string, now it takes an integer. Whereas here it's like, well, last week isolated and ephemeral meant this weaker thing. This week, in the new version, isolated and ephemeral means this much stronger thing.
Wouldn't that be a point difference though, where it would be like version 3.2 was one meaning of ephemeral, and then 3.3 would be, but they're all technically 3, so you don't have to bump?
Well, so I think the thing that is, so that works for when we're producing it, but for the end consumer, the consumer might, let's say, have a policy that says, oh, okay, well, when I'm looking at my version of SLSA and yada, yada, I really want to make sure that the claims of isolated and ephemeral mean this. And then, oh, that changed. And so now, yes, there's a new version. I think that sort of thing is like, how do I consume that? And how do I tell, my end users on how to consume some of those smaller semantic differences can get complicated. I personally don't have a great answer outside of like, we could just do our best.
I mean, I feel like that happens today with like FIPS, where somebody says, I will only use version 2.7. I will not use 2.6, and I will not use 2.8 because I have decided that this is FIPS compliant, and they will not use a different point version. And if the vendor providing them stuff provides a different version, they're like, no, I also need this version because that's the one my company said so.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of thing, as much as we can, we're trying to avoid in the community, because then obviously the thing is, like, it's one thing if an individual company sets up a specific requirement. It's going to be a whole other thing when SLSA is trying to be as much like, even though various companies can use it, right? It's mostly for open source, and for producing open source or consuming open source. And if a bunch of different open source providers, if it, just as an example, if like some packaging and build ecosystem, like, I don't know, if Debian says all of our stuff is SLSA version 2 and Arch Linux says all of our stuff is SLSA version 2.3, it can very quickly become an unmanageable mess.
I guess with the FIPS example, my thought was it's going to be a very small subset of people that are going to necessarily care that ephemeral changed from X to Y. They might have a different bit flip on their CI/CD pipeline that says, assuming this, it's less trusted, assuming this, it's more trusted. But I feel like the people who are going to outright reject it are probably going to be a smaller group, unless it's a major change, in which case that really shouldn't be a minor version. If we decided ephemeral meant, something wildly different, like you have to use the new VMware or whatever, I have no idea. Insert goofy example here. That could potentially be like a major bump, because it's not just a small meaning change, it's a big meaning change.
All right, I don't want to take up too much more time on this. I think there's a lot here, and it's going to probably require some additional discussion and offline and all that good stuff. So one of the other issues, and I want to just go over this one real quickly so we can get to some of the other stuff. So there is, and to be clear, there's a bunch of other issues. I'm just not exactly sure which ones are there, but there was one here from, I believe it was Andrew. Yep, Andrew. Asking some, probably we just need to make sure that it's really clarified in the requirements around what it counts as remote execution, what is isolated and ephemeral. So I put in my 2 cents on it, but basically, he has a bunch of questions about some of the requirements around isolated and ephemeral is like this build should not call out to remote execution unless it's considered part of the builder within the trust boundary. His worry is, would this prevent the vendoring of binary content as some process of the build was performed outside the trust boundary, prevent curling, yada, yada. I think the thing that I try to, at least I know in some of our stuff, the way I'd always interpreted it, and maybe the requirements just need to be a bit more, the wording just needs to be a bit more explicit, is I always viewed all of these things as being dependencies. So they would be considered separate builds. So if something else came in and it was another dependency, yeah, that's just another dependency. SLSA is currently not transitive. And so most of these things that might be coming from other locations are just considered dependencies. They might or might not have SLSA attestations associated with them, but they're coming from a different trust boundary, so they're just considered dependencies. Whereas the actual like compilation, building, and packaging step should be isolated and ephemeral, right? Where it can't modify other builds, it can't interact with other builds. The build environment needs to be cleaned up at the end. And that sort of thing. And that if you are using a binary cache, the binary cache should be underneath that trust boundary, right? Where, if you're doing partial compilation of things, it's part of that entire SLSA builder. Whereas if you pull the binary cache from another location, that is kind of, should just be considered a dependency. Like if you pull a dependency from, I'm just saying, like if you pull a dependency from like a Debian package or whatever, hey, that's outside of your trust boundary, that's considered a dependency. That's the way I've viewed it, but I wanted to get other folks' thoughts on this as well. Also, if there's anything I said that doesn't make sense, feel free to ask.
So you're basically saying as long as it's a pre-controlled or predefined component within your trusted system, build system, if it is, you're good. If it's not, then it's considered an external call.
Or an external dependency. Like the way that we have been sort of defining it is largely like, if let's say I'm building a Python package and that Python package requires a bunch of external dependencies. Well, what my SLSA element, when I do my SLSA build, I'm only doing the SLSA build for that specific Python code that I pulled in. If I pull in other things that it depends on, those are considered external dependencies, they get recorded in the materials section in some fashion, whether it's an SBOM link or something else. Those would get recorded. But the idea here is that they're not like when an end user knows like, oh, that's not what I'm trusting. I'm not trusting the dependencies. I'm trusting the build of this thing. I'm trusting the build of that thing did the right steps. But if you were to do something like as part of your building compilation step, and I know this is a big issue in certain ecosystems like NPM, where, hey, even doing an NPM build could potentially curl out to some other random location as part of literally the build step and start downloading and doing all sorts of things that are hard to trace. That sort of thing is what we want to prevent. Is we want to prevent, like, let's just assume you have a hash, and the hash consists of all of your dependencies. Let's just say there's one hash and it consists of all of your dependencies. We recorded everything, and that's what we have. If you went out and then, as part of the build, went out to the internet again and started doing a whole bunch of extra stuff, well, that hash is not accurate, right? Because you pulled in other dependencies you don't know. So that's kind of where we really want to make sure that that's like super, super clear to folks, is that's kind of the intent here is to say, when running the build and compilation, that's really hard to understand, right? If you're running a compilation, you're running GCC, whatever, you're taking C source code or C++ or whatever, and you're transforming it into a binary. That process is hard to understand. If you include stuff like, well, it reached out to NTP for this, and it reached out to this API call to fetch this other information, or it then curled these other binaries as part of the literal compilation, then you don't have an understanding of what your dependencies are anymore. I think that's the intent. Sorry, my rant's over.
So I think that makes sense. Would it be okay to say, I mean, essentially you're trying to make the input static. You don't want to start getting things to change the input, right, of the process. Basically, you don't want it to change dynamically throughout the build.
Yes. Brendan?
I was going to ask, where do we want to draw the line for that external? Knowing some of the stuff that I've been working on my side projects of like making an HTTP proxy that is itself something you would attach as a sidecar to your build. And that proxy itself is completely hermetic itself, but the build process is talking to that proxy.
So the way that it's worded, and I think this makes sense with the requirements, is that if you consider that part of the build system, it's part of that same trust boundary, then that's fine.
Okay.
Now, with that said, right, you might still say, like, if you are pulling in these external dependencies, let's just assume for a second that you're still like saying, hey, I have an internal cache of NPM packages or whatever, and that's part of the build sidecar. You might still say, hey, no, that's not, I did not build those things under my own trust boundary, so I'm not making that claim. So you might still do that. But in cases where, let's just assume for a second that everything you're building is in your own trust boundary, you're publishing it to an internal build cache, then yes, that would totally work. But if you're talking about like you're proxying external things, then I would still say, hey, that you would probably want to make the claim that no, I'm still not saying that the things I pulled externally are actually good, just that I can reproduce it, right? Like that I have recorded, these NPM dependencies or whatever, or PyPI, dependencies or whatever, and then I can rerun it.
Yeah, the build itself is hermetic, but doesn't mean you just necessarily trust everything upstream. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that, one of the open questions with an eventual reintroduction of a SLSA 4 would be something like, hey, that thing that you're doing with the hermetic sort of hermetic build would be something that allows you to hit those requirements. But you still might say, hey, look, even though I can hit the requirements, I'm still not making any claim that transitively, these things I pulled upstream are SLSA. Andres.
Hey, Mike. So I'm hearing that as the spec continues to evolve, definitions are going to be more crisp. And as those happen, well, what's the right versioning to represent that? And tied to, well, if people have a clear understanding of what they were getting with 1.0 and that suddenly changes and the attestations are different, I came here today hoping to get a sense of a roadmap for what is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.0. And I don't like, I'm hearing several things that you have a strong sense of, well, we're going to have a new definition for level 4. We're going to have a new definition for what isolated means. We may have different guarantees around reproducibility. So would it be worthwhile rather than, well, there's a version bump, something evidently changed that is major, let's go read the change log. Would it be beneficial to give people the heads up through a roadmap of what is expected to change short term and midterm?
So yeah, so that is actually part of that issue is, so one of the things is we have the SLSA 1.0, which should be going live after, after the, like a full release, most likely at the end of this month. Or well, we're at least closing up feedback by the end of this month. It might be a little bit after that. And so for us, I think the thing that we're still trying to kind of get super crisp is that meta issue of how do we define these future releases and what are the expectations that should be changing? And so that's another thing I think we want to get done by 1.0 so that post 1.0 people know, okay, yes, 1.1 will mean this, right? Like these are the sorts of changes you might expect. And then these are also the things that are on the roadmap. But for right now, we've been super focused on just sort of the 1.0 piece while teasing out those other meta issues as part of that release.
Were there things as you're cutting the release candidate that the team wanted to do, but there was just no time and they prioritized for release candidate and said like, no, we're leaving this things out for a later point in time? Obviously, with the release candidate, things at what you caught at is going to be improving those things that exist and are available versus the things you wanted to do and didn't. Yep.
So there's a bunch of things, and I don't remember exactly where Mark has all of that. It's somewhere in the site and might not be the easiest thing to find, but there are a couple of things like, hey, we cut out L4 because we used to have L4. We cut out L4 because the definitions were a little unclear. There's a lot of confusion around hermeticity and a confusion around some of these other pieces, as well as a lot of the tools that we were looking at just don't necessarily support it. And even though we want it to be obviously very aspirational, like it should be difficult to do. And even if there's no tools that can hit it exactly, we want to make sure that folks can eventually hit it. The issue is that there's just like so much confusion around it. We got rid of that. And then in addition to that, I think, yeah, we're trying to kind of tease out some of these other pieces. Like we pretty much said version 1 is purely about the build. We're not talking about source integrity outside of the idea that if you pull something, you should be trusting the build to actually be pulling down the right thing. You shouldn't be assuming that the build is like, hey, the build said it. You shouldn't. One second. No. You shouldn't trust that if the build pulled down X, it shouldn't have pulled down Y.
So, Mike, there are two pieces that are meant to try to address what you're talking about on the website. There's in the 1.0 spec, there is a page that's called What's New. In the RC version, it's very limited, but there is I think it has been already expanded in the 1.0 draft. And then there's a section on future directions, which also gives some hints as to, things that have actually been removed, like level 4, and talks a little bit about what's coming. But I think this is a great feedback that we should take into account to try to beef up those sections so that we do give people, more information as to how we foresee the future in this space.
Obviously, with the caveat that it's forward-looking statements and it's subject to you
Absolutely.
you may have an advisory the day before and do something entirely different.
Indeed, we cannot be bound to what we say there. So there's got to be the right disclaimer around it saying, hey, this is just what we are thinking at the time of writing.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Cool. So I want to give enough time for Arno on the next, the getting started topic.
Yeah, it's just a quick announcement, really more than anything else. I just want to point out that there's a page called Get Started on the SLSA Dev website, which has been updated. And basically, what's important to know, I mean, we kind of limited most of the content to information related to freely available build systems, but there is also a section at the very end that lists different builders. And the idea is that eventually, I mean, there's been work on the certification program for SLSA, but we don't have it yet. And so once we have that, we will have, more of an official list. And but for now, there is a list which is self-claims, right? And so this is completely open. Anybody who has a builder that claims to, comply with a certain level of SLSA can basically submit a pull request to get added to that list. And we probably should have some link associated with the builder because there's just a name, and I suppose that's not very, but I just want to point that out because I know there are people like we heard from Nicole earlier, they're working on one, and there will be many others, hopefully, if we're successful.
If
And
I can figure out where to do the PRs, there's 2 other teams I know of. TestifySec that does Witness, which is open source. I'll ping them as soon as I figure out how to get a PR in for us. That I'll ping some other groups that I'm aware of to get them in as well.
so
and
if
also
you go to that
GitLab,
section,
so-
I mean, it's I actually added the disclaimer in the section to say, hey, this is provided as is, OpenSSF makes no claim, blah blah blah.
Yep.
Because we don't want to have any liabilities related to this. So it's really just for your information. The idea is to help people who are out there and they're going to say, hey, I heard SLSA 1.0 is out. How do I get to doing this? And we can provide people with information that help them get on their way. And so,
Yeah,
the
but
more
I
the
don't want to
merrier.
go adding people. Like I know GitLab does it, and I know Witness does it, and I know some other groups do it, but I don't want to add them without their permission. So I'll probably start PRs and then tag them in their PRs because it's kind of rude to
Yeah.
just add people to websites.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And this is why, I think what's important is to socialize that there's this list there and that people are, invited to make to make PRs against it. That's all. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
I'm just going to bring something from my GitLab days that may help here. Sometimes putting a small statement at the bottom, like right now it says if a build option is misclassified, open or submit a PR against it. We may want to add at the bottom, like anyone is open to suggest an edit by opening a PR. Because right now it sounds like you're only allowed to fix items, not suggest items. So people are sometimes hesitant.
Wait. If you think a build option is misclassified or want to add one, please open an issue or submit a PR. What's
Right,
missing?
but if you squish them together, people don't like to read. I know it sounds terrible, but people get overwhelmed. So like change that into 2 separate sentences, and that may actually make it more clear to people. I know
You're
it sounds
welcome to submit
pedantic.
a PR to make
I
them.
will absolutely submit a PR. But yeah, I just found
Thank
working
you.
with other open source projects, if you smoosh sentences together, people get a
I
little
hear you.
like, stressed out.
No problem.
All right, cool. Yeah, okay, so I doubt we'll have enough time, and I know that Melba was one of the folks who was super had a lot of thoughts about the other issue about the splitting up source and build, because I know that's one of the things that we still wanted to kind of make sure that we had a clear distinction as we go into actually, as we go into post 1.0, we want to make sure that it was clear, like, hey, here's the stuff that we're working on the roadmap. And then here's clearly the distinction between, what is the limit of SLSA 1.0, and here are the things that we're working on for post SLSA 1.0. And I know that there was some thoughts and discussion and confusion around exactly what counted as source versus build. So we want to talk about that, but I think with only 9 minutes left, I doubt we'll be able to get to it. But yeah, actually, hold on, let me double check. Is there anything else on the agenda that anybody added? My tabs are all messed up. Okay, cool. If not, here, I'll just put this. You all can have 9 minutes back, unless there's something else somebody wanted to bring up real quick. Nope. All right. Well, I'll see you all next week.
See you later. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.